Firstly, I'd like to welcome you all. Thanks for coming along. And before I introduce our guest speaker, Kerry Sculthorpe, I just want to spend a couple of minutes explaining about the Royal Society and in particular about the context of this lecture. So the Royal Society of Tasmania, it's one of a group of Royal Societies around the world, all of which more or less have as their goal the advancement of knowledge. That's what we're about. And we try to achieve that goal by running lectures like this, and we also publish a journal and non-fiction books, mostly kind of natural history or history books. We offer awards to outstanding scholars, and we also sponsor a number of educational events every year. This particular Royal Society, the Royal Society of Tasmania, has been operating continuously since 1843. That's 180 years of continuous operation, and it played a really important part in the development of the early colony. The Royal Society established the Botanic Gardens, and it had a museum. It was called the Royal Society Museum, and both of those were gifted to the state, and the museum kind of evolved into TMAG. And there was also a general promotion and interest in research and scholarship that underpinned how the society operated and continues to operate. But in the early history, there were multiple dark episodes. The society was involved in actions that had profoundly negative impacts on Tasmanian Aboriginal people. And this society was regarded as kind of a leader in the community, but in this context failed to challenge attitudes and beliefs that were both misleading and destructive, and again having negative impacts on Tasmanian Aboriginal people. In February 2021, the Society offered an apology to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, and as part of that apology, we also made a commitment to build a supportive and respectful relationship with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. And one of the ways we're trying to do that is by inviting Tasmanian Aboriginal scholars and leaders to give lectures in our regular lecture program, and building on that commitment to improve the relationship. So this year in particular, having Tasmanian Aboriginal speakers has proven to be very important because, as you'll all be aware, we're going to be voting in the Voice referendum later in the year. So it's a very good opportunity for us to provide a forum for Tasmanian Aboriginal speakers. So we invited two speakers from the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, Michael Mansell and Kerry Sculthorpe, and they both agreed to speak. We heard from Michael 3 weeks ago, and he ended his lecture by encouraging everybody to come to Kerry's lecture and to hear a completely different view of the issues around the voice. In hosting these lectures by Michael and Kerry that particularly focus on the voice, the Royal Society is providing a venue, providing a forum for learning about the issues and for discussion. The Society doesn't endorse any particular position in relation to the voice referendum. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Kerry Sculthorpe. Kerry's a well-known and very highly respected member of the Palawa community. She's got decades of experience in government policy and administration in relation to Aboriginal Australians. And that history is the foundation for her advocacy. I knew I'd have a problem with that word. Advocacy for Aboriginal rights and recognition. And recently she was a member of the government committee, the co-design committee that was charged with the responsibility of figuring out regional and local arrangements for the voice process. We're very lucky to have Kerry, or fortunate to have Kerry address us today, because she's been in great demand at this time to speak at public events. Her title today, Referendum Road, an exploration of the voice to Parliament, how we got here and what we might expect after the referendum. So please join me in welcoming Kerry to the lectern.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Thank you. I'd like to take a moment just now to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Mawinana here in Nipaluna. The Mawinana formed part of what we now refer to as the Southeast Nation, and sadly, neither they nor any other members of the Southeast Nation leave any descendants. They didn't survive the British invasion. So these lands have been inherited by the Palawa and have never been surrendered. And what this really means is that the Aboriginal people here in this state live under occupation. We remember with great respect those people who came before us and our fallen, who trod so lightly on these lands. So here we are. Thank you for inviting me to speak about an issue that is topical today, and thank you also to the audience, those who came out in person, and to those of you listening in on Zoom for the interest that you're showing in the subject. I'm not the first of my family to stand before the membership of the Royal Society of Tasmania. My 2 times great-grandmother, Fanny Smith, did so in 1899 when she agreed to be recorded speaking and singing in her mother tongue. I think this pleased her, but she was of interest to the Royal Society at the time because she was considered to be the last living example of her race and therefore of some considerable scientific interest. So now here I am. Neither she nor I could have imagined such a thing, and I think she would have been amused by seeing me here today. Well, we're going to have a referendum to decide whether or not a new section should be added to the Australian Constitution to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of the country by enabling the Parliament to legislate to establish a body which may give advice to it on matters affecting Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders. 6 years on from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, some people are wondering what on earth possessed those people out there in the desert to think that asking permission of the Australian people about something so innocuous was a good idea. The proposal could not have any impact on the daily lives of 97% of the population, yet they are the ones who will decide if a modest, in fact timid, proposal, which concerns 3% of the population, will be permitted. So, how did we get to this point? There's a long history of recommendations to government, as you'd know, regarding the situation of Aboriginal people since we were dispossessed of our lands, and I want to mention just a few key moments here. It was some 40 years ago when the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke promised a treaty with the Aboriginal people would be negotiated by 1990. A powerful scare campaign soon put paid to that idea. The early 1990s saw a number of landmark events. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was established to deliver self-determination. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody presented its report to the Commonwealth Government. This report contained 339 recommendations. They were wide-ranging and were aimed at reducing the number of Aboriginal people who were taken into custody and who died in the custody of the state. And many of them were directed at addressing what were described as underlying issues. At the time, Australia had the highest rate of incarceration of Indigenous people in the world. There was for a while a flurry amongst government departments to get the recommendations ticked off, but most of them were never properly implemented, and it wasn't long before all the activity just faded into oblivion. The early 1990s also saw the landmark High Court decision in the Mabo case, which confirmed that Australian law could accommodate native title to land. Then in 1991, the government decided that Aborigines might be well served by a nation-building exercise, which would unite Australia. The catchphrase would be reconciliation and would have a program of activities over a 10-year time frame. A reconciliation council was established and its membership of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people was appointed. It was chaired by the now Senator Patrick Dodson. And as you'd know, the council initiated all sorts of activities designed to bring Black and White Australia together, to help white Australians get to know and understand Aboriginal people. It culminated in the highly popular walks across bridges in capital cities across the country, showing support for Aboriginal people, or perhaps more accurately, it now seems, for reconciliation. In the course of its work, the Council recommended to Government that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be acknowledged in the Constitution. Good idea. This seems to be the first mention of such a proposal in recent times. And this was an era where Aboriginal people held out some hope for change for better in their lives. The 2005 report of the Social Justice Commissioner, though, brought attention to the worsening situation of Aboriginal people across all social indicators, and it gave rise to the Close the Gap campaign, which continues to this day at the pace of a snail, and in some areas the gap is now widening, and I'll say more about this later. In 2007, an inquiry established to look into sexual abuse of children in the Northern Territory presented its report to the Northern Territory Government. It made 97 recommendations about improving the standard of living and the services available to Aboriginal communities. Many of those recommendations focused on prevention, and the report stressed the importance of working alongside Aboriginal people and communities. And incidentally, no charges were laid as a result of that inquiry. The Commonwealth chose to respond to that report by suspending the Racial Discrimination Act, sacking Aboriginal community councils, replacing them with public servants, and sending in the army and police to spruce things up and get the bad behaviour under control. During this time, the notion of having Aboriginal people recognised in the Constitution remained quietly on the agenda, but all efforts now seem to focus on behaviour management. In 2011, the Commonwealth established an expert panel on the issue of constitutional recognition, not giving up, of Aboriginal people. Its membership comprised both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, and it was tasked with leading a wide-ranging consultation and engagement program to build consensus on the recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution, quotes. The stated aim here was to improve the relationship between Aboriginal people and the Australian people with a focus on nation building and social cohesion. The outcome of the expert panel's report was a further campaign by Reconciliation Australia, which was formerly the Reconciliation Council, and this campaign was called Recognise. The campaign started in 2012 and, funded by the Commonwealth, ran until 2017 when Commonwealth funding ceased. By 2016, the Commonwealth had appointed a 16-member referendum council comprising public figures, both Aboriginal, again, and non-Aboriginal, to oversee consultations with the Aboriginal people and others on the same subject. So what we have now is a series of initiatives over 20 years of government-funded activity around recognising Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders in the Australian Constitution. And some might observe that it was all carefully shepherded by prominent public figures, ensuring the Aboriginal members didn't become too ambitious. There was never a committee comprising only Aboriginal people. The one constant during these years of consultation was that Aboriginal people wanted more than token recognition in the Constitution. There had been frequent calls for another national organisation. The abolition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission had taken Aboriginal issues out of the media and seen a shift away from notions of self-determination and social justice. So throughout 2016 and 2017, a number of curated dialogues overseen by the Referendum Council were held across the country on the question of constitutional recognition. It was in this context that the idea to have an organisation written into the Constitution came about. Although Aboriginal people were being asked if they would like to be recognised in the Constitution, the overwhelming response repeatedly was that people wanted another national organisation. And somewhere the idea emerged that if it was entrenched in the Constitution, it would not be able to be abolished at the stroke of a pen. Now, transcripts of the dialogues and to hear what people had to say are available on the internet. The dialogues culminated in the coming together of 250 Aboriginal people from across the country in 2017 at what was known as the First National Constitutional Convention, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart was born. It must have been an emotional moment for many of those people. A fine piece of prose, even better as oratory, the statement was deliberately addressed to the Australian people, and it took the form of an explanation and an invitation. Now, after all of that, the Prime Minister of the day simply said, "We're not doing that." The tone having been set for the country's response, we then went through a period of scurrilous misrepresentation of the statement and what it was asking for, most of it led by parliamentarians on the government side. Nevertheless, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs was allowed to go ahead with a co-design process for a voice to Parliament, which might be legislated. The National Indigenous Affairs Agency led a process involving several appointed committees to consider what a voice might look like at the local, regional and national levels. And all 281 pages were published in July 2021. So this is a summary of the main events leading to where we now are. But I just want to go back for a moment. From 1990 until 2005, we had a nationally elected Aboriginal organisation in ATOC. It was established at a time when there was a certain degree of goodwill towards Aboriginal people, and it comprised both elected and administrative arms. The administrative arm, the staff, were all members of the Australian Public Service. Over the years, from the 1970s, governments would establish, then abolish Aboriginal advisory groups. First we had the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, then the National Aboriginal Conference, then the Aboriginal Development Commission, which ran programs, and then of course the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Commission, which was tasked with advising government and running some programs. The pattern, of course, was that after a few years these organisations gained in confidence and became more critical of government. So a review would be held most people, of course, would find something to criticise and the organisation would be abolished. In the case of ATOC, the incoming government in 1996 was highly antagonistic right from the outset. It ordered a special audit to find the mismanagement and corruption it was alleging. The books of all the organisations ATOC funded were audited. There was never going to be any corruption found because the staff, being public servants, knew how to manage money, write policy, design and administer programs. And of course, it understood how government works. The grants program had always been tightly managed. ATOC had been under close scrutiny from the very beginning, especially by those who were opposed to the idea that Aborigines could make good decisions about their own lives. When the audit came up clean, the government continued its attack on the credibility of the organisation in various ways. Just before the change of government in 1996, the then Prime Minister had asked ATOC to advise on a social justice package following the High Court Mabo decision. ATOC produced a major policy platform in the form of a report to government entitled Recognition, Rights and Reform. The report was produced under the guidance of the elected representatives and it proposed wide-ranging structural reforms designed to move Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from being treated as welfare dependents to being active participations in the development, implementation and monitoring of programs through their elected representatives. This was to be a rights-based approach, and it drew on international standards being developed to ensure that the universal human rights adopted by the United Nations after the Second World War could also be enjoyed by Indigenous peoples across the globe. Now, the ATOC report, Recognition, Rights and Reform, contained 113 recommendations, all very moderate and considered. The recommendations were met with silence and inaction. Although ATOC was tasked with advising government on policy, there remained in the Prime Minister's department an Office of Indigenous Affairs to give more objective advice to the government and to carry on the work of supporting the Minister and the government. This remains today in the form of the National Indigenous Affairs Agency, which is sometimes mistaken for an organisation acting in the interests of the Aboriginal people. And it will remain if a voice is established. By the end of the 20th century, here we are now, there we were then, the government has succeeded in discrediting ATOC to such an extent that the opposition of the day even promised to abolish it if it was elected. The government of the day declared the experiment in self-determination a failure, and ATOC was abolished in 2005. From this point onwards, grant funding was removed from Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, slowly but surely, and service delivery was increasingly provided by non-Aboriginal organisations. Now, The Guardian recently did a fact check on the campaign materials of the Yes and No campaigns. And from this we learn that as at December 2021, of all grants paid out by the National Indigenous Affairs Agency, that is the government department, 39% of those grants were being paid to 589 non-Indigenous corporations, charities and organisations. The beneficiaries of these grants included Crown, Fortescue and Woolworths, and the list goes on. So this is where a substantial proportion of government funding for service to Aboriginal people is going. And this sort of thing has in fact been going on since at least the 1980s, but no one's really talking about it much. So these days, no one even dares mention the word ATOC, you may have noticed, except those declaring it corrupt. No one even dares mention the words national organisation or representative organisation. So tainted was ATSIC's reputation. And neither is there ever a mention of self-determination or rights, Indigenous rights or citizens' rights. So now apparently we just want to have a voice. We want to have a seat at the table, but not while the decisions are being made. Now I just want to mention a few key moments which in my view help explain where we are now, making such a meek and timid request of the Australian people. I mentioned earlier that the now Senator Patrick Dodson, who had earned a formidable reputation as social justice campaigner, was appointed by the government to chair the Reconciliation Council. Towards the end of his tenure, he spoke out against the government and was not appointed to another government position. Similarly, Dr. Loacha O'Donoghue, the first chairperson of ATSIC, who had served several governments loyally, after speaking out against the Commonwealth Government, was never appointed to another position. Excuse me a minute. Patricia Turner, the only ever Aboriginal Chief Executive Officer of ATSIC, was also the only ATSIC CEO not to be appointed to another government position at the same level. Ms Turner had always given frank and fearless advice to government in what she considered were the best interests of the Aboriginal people. And probably a bit too frank and a bit too fearless. She never saw her job as managing the blacks. And let's not forget Cathy Freeman, loved by all. In celebration of her first major international athletic victory, did a lap of honour holding the Aboriginal flag. She was criticised and denigrated, and she never did it again. It was never an option for her to say that her first thoughts were for her own people, that she was running for them and she was lifting them up with her victory. She had to learn to bend. Most of us have had to learn to bend in one way or another, so as not to offend the majority. And there's no need to labour the point by citing the many other incidents in the sporting arena by both spectators and commentators. There are just too many of them to still be regarded as isolated incidents. It's worth noting that a study published only 4 years ago, which looked at poorer outcomes amongst marginalised groups, found that 3 out of 4 Australians hold implicit bias against Aboriginal people, even if it is unconscious. The study went on to talk about the effect such unconscious bias can have on the daily lives of marginalised people. I think this is evidence that if some of the effort that goes into changing the behaviour of Aboriginal people was diverted to examining the behaviour of those around them, we might see more of the change that we're all looking for. If more attention was paid to the attitudes and behaviours of those who make decisions about Aboriginal people, and to changing the structures and the institutions within which Aboriginal people have to conduct their daily lives, we might see the beginnings of a more equitable society. We see even now open hostility at the suggestion that Aboriginal people might have any sort of arrangement different from those of the majority. We're hearing Aboriginal people talk on the television about the importance of nation building, and the Minister giving assurances about what an advisory body will not be doing. Aboriginal young people are taking their own lives in unprecedented numbers. Aboriginal men, women and children are being locked up at unprecedented levels, and children are being removed from their families in unprecedented numbers. In these circumstances, nation building and patriotism should not be the primary concerns of Aboriginal spokespersons. The Getting to Know You and Getting to Like You campaign, run by the Reconciliation Advocates for 15 years, hasn't improved the social indicators of wellbeing of Aboriginal people, so perhaps we ought to declare that as a failed experiment too. Now, some things have been missing from recent conversations about Aboriginal Australia. In the mid-1980s, the United Nations started looking at the plight of Indigenous peoples across the globe. Some countries like New Zealand, Canada and the United States had entered into treaties with Indigenous people, but failure to uphold the terms and dispossession were common threads across the colonising states. Nevertheless, treaties had been negotiated between the colonisers and the tribal leaderships. They did not have committees made up of colonisers and colonised making recommendations to the colonial authorities about how they should be governed. The issue of concern in the 1980s was that Indigenous people had all been colonised and were living in countries where they would always be a small minority. They had all been dispossessed of their lands to varying degrees, and their social, economic and governance structures were being broken down by the majorities that now occupied their lands, and consequently their cultures, their ways of life and their very lives were at risk. In 1985, work commenced at the United Nations to establish minimum standards for the survival, dignity and well-being of Indigenous peoples from across the globe. ATOC participated actively in this important work during its lifetime. The work culminated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is accepted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007, with 144 countries voting in favour. Australia was one of 4 countries which voted against the declaration at the time. These standards are a recognition that Indigenous peoples cannot thrive, or in some cases survive, within the institutions of the nation states within which they now live. And the declaration goes into some detail about the rights of Indigenous people to participate in the institutions of the nations, of the nation states, excuse me, the countries in which they live, but also to have their own institutions and their own structures so that their people can live on equitable terms with the majority populations. At the moment, the Yes campaign is insisting that we need an advisory committee to enable us to build a better nation, and that somehow the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people will be improved by this. And closing the gap seems to be the reason we should vote yes. Nobody can possibly believe that, as is becoming evident in the polls and in the commentary. The request for permission to have an advisory body to the Parliament is being pitched to the Australian people because governments have refused to listen to the very modest demands of the Aboriginal people for generations. We see in the Northern Territory, for example, governments paying attention only when Aboriginal problems spill over into the towns and when businesses are affected. We're seeing a deep-seated racism emerge in the referendum campaign, claims that Aborigines are getting something not available to other people, nasty commentators talking about how they don't like angry blacks and that we should behave in a way which doesn't offend other people. They try to differentiate Aboriginal people who appear kinder and don't challenge them. But no one seemed to mind when a Prime Minister went hysterical and slammed the lectern at the Reconciliation Conference in Melbourne all those years ago, basically demanding that Aborigines conform, stop complaining and trying to be different. The other issue on which government is remaining silent is the current arrangements for closing the gap. Excuse me. The coalition of peaks is a national coalition of peak Aboriginal organisations, each representing their sectors such as health, childcare, legal services, languages, media and so on. Currently, this coalition represents 800 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations across the country. In 2020, after some years of negotiation, this coalition signed a Closing the Gap agreement with the Commonwealth and the states and territories on priority areas for reform and on partnership arrangements between government and Aboriginal community service delivery organisations. Recently, the lead convener of that coalition has been travelling the country, meeting with premiers and their cabinets about the implementation and monitoring arrangements of that agreement. Now, even with all of this effort, we see the Productivity Commission reporting that even now, government decisions taken by governments still often fly in the face of the reforms they have agreed to pursue. Moving on, that's our background. What do we know now about what a voice might look like if the referendum is successful? Well, the first thing to note is that the Parliament will decide on the powers and functions of a voice, on how it will be constituted. There'll be further rounds of consultation, especially regarding the formation of local and regional voices. But from the report of the co-design committees under the previous government, we can be fairly certain about a number of things. A national voice will be drawn from local and regional groups, with local and regional yet to be defined. It will somehow be structured upon 9 lofty principles, which are detailed in the report. We'll be doing everything right because there will be a gender balance, there will be co-chairs, not a single chairperson, and minorities within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities will be guaranteed access to the main body in some way. No one has dared mention the word election. Selection is currently the preferred term. They will work in partnership with government, although I can't quite imagine how governments can be compelled to reciprocate. In a government department and in the life of a government minister, there are just too many competing priorities for true partnerships to become a reality. Well, that's been my experience anyway. And let's not forget that the number of government officials visiting rural and remote communities has been a burden to those communities for decades. The Minister has said the voice won't be constrained by three-year election cycles, Minister for Indigenous Affairs. But governments still will be. They'll still be having elections in the normal way. Now, just take an example. Imagine what would happen if a national voice wanted uniform laws across the country to restrict the trading of liquor outlets and gaming establishments, or if they wanted a sugar tax imposed and subsidised fresh food in remote communities. We've already seen what has happened in Alice Springs when the Northern Territory government decided to extend liquor trading restrictions. And the Minister for Indigenous Affairs and others are already ruling out things a voice will not be advising on. The report says the voice will not duplicate the work of any existing organisation. But since it is being promoted as the primary vehicle for closing the gap, when there is already a Closing the Gap national agreement in place, it will be interesting to see how this actually works. Now, although it's not the case in Tasmania, in other states there are already a multitude of Aboriginal organisations and advisory groups with quite specific functions, so it's hard to see how another body will not duplicate the role of some or how it will add value. What is quite definite is that individuals will not be eligible to be considered for appointment to the voice until they have been declared fit and proper persons by an ethics committee. This is to ensure no unsavoury characters are able to give advice to the Parliament. So we can have unsavoury characters actually in the Parliament, but not advising it. And I'll just mention here by way of example that I, for one, would never submit to such scrutiny. I don't know how other Aboriginal people feel, but a few would probably be feeling a bit like me. Each local or regional group will be required to meet a set of minimum expectations which will be legislated. Each group will have a secretariat which will be provided by the government. The Minister said she'll ask for fresh ideas on intractable problems, with the priorities being health, education, housing and jobs. Well, for example, ever since Aboriginal people have been allowed to live in houses, there has been a huge housing backlog. The solution to that has always been money. And Aboriginal people have always had plenty to say on that and on other matters. That's well documented. And I'm not sure about the need for new ideas when the old ones, as I've indicated earlier, have not been implemented. Now, if the referendum is successful, by the time further consultation has taken place and all of the components of the voice are established, it will be close to 10 years on from the gathering at Uluru. History tells us that this will be approaching the use-by date of a national Aboriginal organisation. So I'm not sure people will still have their hearts in it. It's more likely that many will be thinking, it seemed like a good idea at the time. But none of what I've said here is a reason to vote no. Although there are criticisms of the process that led to the statement, there was nevertheless a process. Not everyone agreed with it. Senator Patrick Dodson has recently written that he was taken aback when he heard it, but he's adjusted. Others were disappointed. But there are many who hold out hope that their lives will change for the better, that they will be listened to, or that it will lead to better things in the future. So why would we not support those people? My very great fear is that the expectations raised by the Yes campaign will leave many Aboriginal people disappointed and feeling let down yet again when they see no improvement in their living situations resulting from a voice, and when horrible things just keep happening to their families. A highly respected clan leader from the Northern Territory, recently deceased and publicly mourned by politicians, this year won a case in the federal court against the Commonwealth for a breach of native title rights, the native title rights of his people. The Commonwealth has sought leave from the High Court to appeal the decision. Now, this would not be a matter upon which advice from the voice would be welcomed by the Commonwealth, but it obviously is a matter of some importance to this clan group. I mention this only because it is a good example of how even powerful and respected voices are not listened to when it doesn't suit. If the referendum fails, there will be many Aboriginal people feeling rejected by the Australian people. There will be no action from the government to give effect to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, since it's never even talked about anyway. There will be no appetite from the Commonwealth to move ahead with treaty or truth-telling, because the message will have been that the Australian people just don't want it. If the vote for no is such a simple, harmless little thing, then certainly nothing more contentious will be taken up by government. If there is a no vote on such a simple thing, government certainly won't go into more difficult territory. The Prime Minister, the Minister and the Yes campaigners will just be exhausted, and the rest of the country will be sick of it. The international press a report that Australia said no to recognising its Indigenous people. Or maybe they will just say, racism still rife in Oz. Oi, oi, oi. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kerry. Kerry has agreed to answer any questions that you've got in the audience in the theatre, and I will check if there are any online. Has anybody got one ready to go? I've got one, which is a reflection of my ignorance. Kerry, why did Australia vote against the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous?
Well, that's a good question. I think they thought it might cause problems. I mean, you know, there were they voted with 3 other countries. I don't know, is the answer?
Right. Was this something that we were all aware of at the time, that was the
No,
position?
this sort of international activity just doesn't get attention in the media.
Right.
And really there was no one to be talking about it because, you know, they'd got rid of ATOC. Who else was going to be talking about it? ATOC was like the lead in all of the international activity that went on to finalise the draft to become an accepted declaration.
Yes.
So the government didn't want it. You know, at the time, I think the Prime Minister's name started with an H, and they just couldn't stand the thought of Aborigines making demands or thinking they were different in any way.
Right.
You know, it was very much, you know, the one nation approach as is being, you know, promoted by so many people even today.
Right. Okay. So I have a question.
Out of interest, which are the other 3 nations that voted no?
Yeah, I think they were Canada, the United States, and possibly New Zealand. I could be I could be wrong about 1 or 2 of those, but I think they were the ones. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was really good. You've pointed to many of the weaknesses associated with the voice, which I agree with. What is the alternative, though? Going back to something like ATSIS? Where would you like things to go?
Well, there is no alternative because there's just simply nothing else on offer. For there to be an alternative, there either has to be an Aboriginal group fighting for something with an idea, or there has to be a government that's offering something else, and there is no alternative. That's the position we're in at the moment, and so, you know, if that's what I'm saying, if these things that are now, or if this one thing that's now on offer is closed down, well, I can't see much happening for a long time.
No, I agree, but I suppose where I was going with that is you've seen the problems with what is being proposed. What would you like to see? If you could have your dream come true, what would there be?
Well, look, that's not likely, but what I can say is that it seems to me that across the country, Aboriginal people are experiencing the same sorts of problems. And there are just so many things that we could and should be talking about together as Indigenous people, as Aboriginal people. And there's just no forum that allows that now. I mean, years ago, people used to have national meetings and get there any way they could, and probably some grant funding would be used for it. Everything's so tightly managed these days. You get a grant, an organisation gets a grant to deliver the service, and my word, you better not do anything else. So there's a lot of scope for a national organisation of elected people to discuss things of mutual concern, as they do, for example, some of the Sami in northern Scandinavia have something like that. And they would then be people who would move on to where we go next. But going back, the major report that ATOC produced all those years ago, Recognition, Rights and Reform, sets out a very good policy platform that puts Aboriginal people in places of decision-making together with the other democratic and power structures of the country.
Thank you. Kerry,
Okay, sorry.
thank you. I've heard you speak before, and I'm here, and you've referred to yourself as a reluctant yes, I think. And for those of us who are also reluctant yeses but want to vote yes, there's also been a bit of a suggestion that we vote yes but write treaty on the bottom of the form. Is that a possibility, or what does that do to the referendum?
Yeah, well, as long as you write yes, I guess it is a yes, and you can write that. And I don't, but it crossed my mind that not just writing treaty or something on the form might be an alternative to writing yes or no, in which case you're doing a donkey vote. But not enough people are ever going to do something like that for it to have an impact. So, write yes, and we can feel a little bit better if we write treaty or, rubbish or something else on the form as well.
If my memory is correct and my interpretation, when Michael Mansell spoke, he indicated that the government, because it has the numbers, could set up an advisory body like the Voice now through Parliament without it having to be incorporated in the Constitution, which to me would save an enormous amount of problem. I'm quite happy for the original inhabitants to have recognition that they were the first original inhabitants, but to have the Voice, I think, is an extraordinary complication if there is a simpler way. Would you like to comment about that? And maybe other people that were here when Michael spoke may have remembered that and also have a comment about that.
Well, yes, what Michael said, of course, it's right. The government could have done that. But what they did instead was accept the Uluru Statement. You see, that's not what the Uluru Statement asked for. And I tried to outline, the reasons why. I think it was a bad idea. Having an organisation in the Constitution, I mean, even we might want things to change. Just because it's in the Constitution, just because the Constitution says that the government may establish a voice, number one, doesn't mean it will happen, and number two, doesn't mean it will be in accordance with all those things that I outlined that are in the co-design report. In fact, they could, if they wanted to, establish an advisory committee of just 6 of their favourite people, as has previously been done. So, this was an election commitment from the government. They said they're going to do it, and they don't like to, to be accused of breaking a promise. Oh, yes, and we see now it's just so political. Quite frankly, it's just sickening, because what I am seeing from the Yes campaign and the government, and, poor Linda Burney, I know she doesn't believe what she's saying. She's had, a long history of working in Aboriginal affairs. They're just using stock standard Labor Party election tactics to get this matter over the line, to get the result that they want. And that's why they won't explain anything, they won't give background about anything. It's just, you want to close the gap, vote yes. Better decisions are made when people they're being made about have a say. Well, for heaven's sake. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to be saying. No wonder they're having trouble in the polls. So, yes, they could have done the other thing, but they're in too deep.
Hello?
Kerry, hello. Thank you. That was great. Can you speak more about...
Your microphone's not actually working. Perhaps closer to your mouth.
Is that better?
Oh,
That's better.
gosh,
Yes.
I hope it was working when I did all that talking.
Yes, could you
No, not
start
you,
again?
Kerry, the question.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Can you please speak more about ATOC and its history? Because my memory of ATOC, and obviously that's coming from mainstream media, is that it was disbanded because of blatant corruption. But you seem to be saying that that was, to use a current term, fake news? Like, was ATOC actually cut off at the knees by a hostile government and they actually weren't corrupt?
There was no corruption in the organisation. You know, it was established at a time when people were more accepting of notions of self-determination and social justice. And then we came to the back to the 50s era in government and had some very nasty people in power. And that's when the smearing of the reputation of ATOC happened. Now, as with every other institution, you know, there was the occasional person in the organisation who perhaps got some bad publicity. But as for the organisation being corrupt, well, it just didn't happen. I mean, the annual audits by the National Audit Office were often very complimentary about the standard of administration in that organisation. Just, you know, for example. I worked in the organisation and it was a bit like, for a lot of the times, a bit like being in a war zone. We were under fire the whole time. We were all so careful to do everything by the book, to leave no room for criticism. So it was just simply an Aborigine hating time. And, you know, it's people sort of like the negative and the sensationalism. There was always room for improvement in that organisation, as there is in any organisation. And I even think now that perhaps some of the amendments to the legislation about how the organisation would function might have been a mistake. But, you know, everything was always above board in the administration of the organisation. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Do you think it's time for somebody like The Guardian to write the actual history of ATOC so that...
Well, yes. Well, I'm pleased to be able to tell you that somebody has been awarded, a group at a university in Sydney have been awarded a large research grant to document the history of that organisation, which, you know, which is a good thing, to make a study of it and to document the history. Yep.
Just a query over here. I'm on this side. Hello?
Oh, right, okay. Over on the left.
Yes, in the edges. There's a book by Kerry O'Brien and Thomas Mayo, The Voice to Parliament Handbook, and I actually went and listened. I listened to the webinar that was put on as well, and you can actually listen to it on YouTube, on the Australian Institute YouTube, The Voice to Parliament. Do you agree with what they're saying?
Well, look, I know that they've put something out, but I haven't had a chance to have a look at what they're saying. But I probably wouldn't be agreeing with them, because I think what they're trying to do is to get the yes vote up, and that they're saying, you know, what needs to be said politically. but I can't say too much because I haven't actually seen what they've said. But, you know, if they're saying that a parliament is going to take the advice, you know, act on the advice given to them by an advisory committee, and that people's lives will be changed as a result of that, I wouldn't agree with that, no.
One in the front.
Okay, thank you very much, Kerry. Can I just ask you to talk a little bit about what the Tasmanian Aboriginal community's involvement was in the development of the Uluru Statement 6 years ago?
Well, a number of people from here were chosen at one of the at the Tasmanian Dialogue to go to Uluru, and they went, and I wasn't one of those. So, you know, they were entrusted with negotiating the best they could. Tasmania was one of the many places who said, we're not satisfied with token recognition, we want more. So if the question is, do you want to be recognised? If you want to be recognised in the Constitution, the answer is we want a national organisation. And so that's the Tasmanian delegation would have gone to Uluru, and that's what they would have tried to get.
Kerry, just over here.
Yep, thank you. Kerry, at the last lecture, when Michael Mansell encouraged us to vote no in the referendum because it wasn't empowering of Aboriginal people and it wasn't delivering on all of the things that were promised in the statement from the heart. So could you respond how the Tasmanian Aboriginal community is seeing this issue?
Sorry, how the Tasmanian Aboriginal community
is seeing this, where we've got leaders in the Tasmanian community recommending that we vote no in the referendum because it's not going to be empowering Aboriginal people.
Yeah, I expect, I think most of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people talking about this would be saying vote no. That's not my view. And I've outlined today the reasons.
If I could just comment on that, one of Michael's big points was that he would be very happy if the referendum was cancelled. And, you know, the next best thing after that was to vote no, because he believed the whole referendum process was a flawed one.
Yes, you know what governments are like. They won't do the right thing by, you know, raising taxes or putting a sugar tax or doing the right thing about gambling, one thing and another. Once they've said something, they just seem to want to stick by it, not budge, whether it's right or wrong. It's all about, you know, it's all about not being caught out, not backing down, not breaking a promise. They seem to be the priorities. Seems so silly.
There's several online, Kerry, and many of them you've actually answered. They've overlapped, but there's one that I will read out. It's from Denise Robinson. Kerry, do you believe the Government of Australia will move towards supporting the implementation of a treaty and self-determination for Aboriginal people if the yes vote is successful?
Hello, Denise. Not really, no. Not in the near term. I think that if the yes campaign gets up, I think everybody will be exhausted, and if they go ahead with moving to set up some sort of advisory body, there'll be quite a bit of fuss about that. I mean, that will take, you know, the Aboriginal Affairs Office, you know, the government department will be busy with that. Aboriginal people who have been campaigning, we will be busy with that too. So when might we get around to the treaty and the truth-telling? Well, I don't think it'll be any time soon.
Right, fair enough. Michael's listened in as well, got one from Michael Mansell. What responsibility for a lost referendum should those pushing ahead regardless take?
What responsibility for a loss should those... Oh, I don't know. It's a bit of a...
Bit of an open question.
It's, well... the first thing is that this is really way beyond the authority and influence of Aboriginal people. It's the majority population that are going to make this decision, and quite a few people will already know how they're going to vote and other people will still be undecided. So who should accept responsibility? Well, I think the main responsibility lies with the people that decided to make such a timid request in the first place, to make such a big fuss about a little thing. You know, that I don't think that they accepted the best advice. I think they could have taken better advice and been more considered, and we would have been on an easier path.
I think perhaps Michael's question is driving at his position, which is that we shouldn't be having a referendum. So we should be perhaps taking steps to stop the referendum as it is presently proposed, going ahead.
All I'll say about that is go ahead and good luck.
Fair enough. One more, one last question.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. It was a really good talk. Really appreciate it. It sort of reminds me a bit of the situation we're in now, and we've got 240 years of massacres and betrayals and stolen generation, incarceration, the whole works. And after 240 years, we've got, this is the best we can do, is have this ridiculous referendum, which shouldn't even be a referendum at all. Things should have been done. And it reminds a bit of the marriage plebiscite, where that exposed the homophobia in the country, even though it got through, but it was an unnecessary thing to happen because the government should have been leading on that anyway without a plebiscite. Same thing now, the government should be leading on without a referendum, and it's because this is just giving the racist a voice, and which, you know, we know it's a very racist country. My problem is, you were saying if we vote no, then you're quashing people's hope, and yet if we vote yes, we're voting for the illusion of someone taking some notice, a voice. It's an illusion. So you're quashing hope or an illusion. I still feel like I'm in a bind of how to go. And I hate being in the position where I have to cast a vote on something that should be happening anyway. So it's...
Yeah, look, I agree with you. It's a very difficult situation we find ourselves in, but I think the promotional materials have caused quite a few Aboriginal people around the country, mainly in rural and remote areas, people who are not in capital cities, to believe that this will be a good thing for them. And for me, you know, if we're talking about, Michael, about responsibility, this is where the government has some responsibility for misleading, more than anyone else, misleading Aboriginal people. But, you know, I agree with what you've said. It's a difficult position we're in.
We'll take one last question, just in the front.
Well, it's like an observation. I just see, first of all, my heart just goes out to the anguish I feel for the treatment of Indigenous people in Australia. I'm ashamed many times. I feel that we've got Aboriginal people in a dark room, it's locked. Someone's saying, we'll open the door. I don't know what's out there myself. And there may be hope, there may be hopes dashed, but it's like someone saying, we're going to open the door. Anyway.
Oh, a yes vote will
might
leave the door open.
Maybe.
Yes, I think there's something to be said for that. But and thank you for your earlier remarks, because in my opinion, Aboriginal Australia lives in what's known as a total institution. Remember the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, yes. The asylum? We live in a total institution, whereas government allows us to do certain things and to go only so far. And there appears no way out. And change happens, but you have to fight really hard to get change, and it happens very slowly and over a long period of time. So, you know, just for an example, when I was a child, I would never have dared call myself an Aborigine, you know. So all these years later, at least I'm able to do that now. Mm. So, you know, there's a time frame we're talking about. We're talking about generations, and we might have to wait a few more generations to get any change. But in the meantime, you know, the shocking thing is that the lives of children, young people are at risk. And, you know, I know that, for example, suicide is a big problem across the whole country, but it's so much bigger a problem. And when you have your young people who are meant to be leaders of the future just killing themselves for reasons that, you know, they have no hope, see no future for themselves in the country that once was their own, I think we just need to try to be getting agitated a bit more often and a bit more loudly.